Springs are a particularly interesting type of groundwater feature. A spring is a natural outlet from which groundwater flows onto the ground surface. So this is an area that you actually get completely natural discharge from the groundwater system. And on the screen you can see a couple of really cool examples of some springs in Arizona. One of our most famous is Fossil Creek or Fossil Springs. And if you look closely at the picture, you can see that characteristic blue-green color of water that's carrying a lot of sediment as dissolved load, and that's because this particular water has been flowing through limestone, and that's pretty common in a spring system just because limestone carries a lot of groundwater easily. On the right is Roaring Spring in the Grand Canyon. At the very top you can see that big steep cliff that we all know and love from the canyon. And as you make your way down, you can see there's definitely a layer there where there's water. There's a waterfall just coming out of the wall. And so this is one of the really cool ways you can get springs where it just does look like it's shooting out of the wall. So there's lots of things that can cause a spring. So discharge at a spring can be caused by rock layers with varying porosities, and that's what's happening at the Grand Canyon here. So you have really permeable layers above, and then below those permeable layers you have an impermeable layer. So as the water makes its way down through those permeable layers, it hits that impermeable, or probably like a clay. So it hits that layer of clay, and then it just starts spreading out, and eventually it's going to hit the surface, and that's where your water comes out. Another thing that can cause it is where the water table meets the surface, like on a hill, like in this picture. So this happens where you've got lots of topography and usually particularly humid environments where the water table is very close to the surface anyway. Can also happen, here's another example of where you have an impermeable layer where the water table reaches the surface. So this is sort of a combination of both of those two. But this is called a perched water table, just because you have a little lens, so it only happens in a few smaller places. This also happens where layers that are offset by faults meet the surface. The fault is a particularly easy conduit for water to flow. But then you can see in the picture you have granite on the right. You can recognize that by that cupcake sprinkles pattern on it, which tends to be impermeable, and obviously permeable layers on the left. So when that permeable layer meets that fault, all the water gets forced upward, and that's where you get discharge. This happens along the San Andreas Fault. That's why we have places like Palm Springs or Desert Hot Springs, is because those lie along the San Andreas Fault and create springs in those areas. You can also find these in fractured rock, where a fracture meets the surface. So those are some pretty common ways to get those, but I thought I'd show you some kind of fun examples of groundwater discharge, where you have thermal groundwater or hot groundwater. Now this hot groundwater comes from usually either some sort of heat source like a magma chamber, or it could just come from the natural heat of the Earth's interior. And so when the groundwater is heated by these underground heat sources, depending on how hot it actually is, you can get some really cool stuff. So in both of these cases, these are geysers. So a geyser is a fountain of steam and hot water that erupts periodically from a vent in a geothermal region. And Yellowstone is a beautiful example of a geothermal region. And so you can see in the diagram here, the groundwater seeps down into the system. It's heated by the magma chamber that's fueling the volcanoes there. And then eventually it's heated enough that it starts to boil and it turns into steam, and that's when you get that eruption. On the bottom is a location in Nevada called the Fly Geyser. This is another area where you have hot water that's shooting out of the ground. I think this one does it a little more continuously. My understanding is that this was not completely natural, that some sort of drilling project actually punctured the aquifer And because of the great pressure, it actually forced the water out in this case. My understanding is that this is private land, but you can visit it. If we look at hot springs and geysers that are throughout the United States, you can tell there's definitely some locations that are sort of preferentially have these hot springs. So most of the time when you see these, it's going to be in the western part of the country. That's just because this is some of the youngest tectonically speaking. You've had a lot of tectonic activity along the west coast of the United States, and the east doesn't have quite as much. Some locations that show up really nicely are places like Yellowstone. You can see Yellowstone is a big red dot, but there's some other kind of interesting places like Arkansas. Hot Springs is pretty famous. And then locations throughout the Appalachians, and these are probably just because the groundwater is heated by the Earth's interior at those locations. Some of my favorites include the mud pots at the Salton Sea. The Salton Sea actually has very high. The area where the mud pots are found is actually pretty small. It's maybe like a city block or less. But it's really cool, and you've got all these pots. Some of them are hotter than others. Some you can stick your hand down in, and it's nice and warm. Some of them I wouldn't get anywhere near because it is super boiling. Even in Yellowstone, sometimes those thermal springs they have in Yellowstone are hot enough that it can boil your flesh off, which is pretty gnarly. Plus, they're super acidic. Arizona has quite a few thermal areas. There's a couple of pretty famous hot springs there. There's the Ringbolt Hot Springs. It's a pretty, fairly easy hike. The Colorado River just south of Hoover Dam. It's like 3.5 or so miles, I think. So that's a nice, cool way to see it. Or there's actually some locations out in Tonopah, just west of the valley, or even an old location here in Mesa that had hot springs. I think that's closed down at this point, but you used to go in and be able to bathe inside the hot springs and inside the building in Mesa.